First of all, I'm very grateful to the organizers of the conference for the exchange being made possible, and my thanks are all the more heartfelt because the team of the Museum Jews in Latvia helped me from the very beginning of this research, which is dedicated to this painting. Entitled The Last Way, this artwork is dedicated to the Babi Yar massacre. The painter Yosef Kuzkovski, born in 1902 in Mogilov, in a modest family, grew up in a Yiddish-speaking environment and studied in a traditional Jewish school. He worked in Soviet Ukraine till the 40s, then in Soviet Latvia from 48 till 69, and this painting has been made famous by its exposure in the Knesset, starting by the beginning of the 70s. This picture, which was said forbidden in the Soviet Union, has thus become a key element of the interpretation of the Kuzkovski's career as a painter of the Holocaust, an oppressed person in the Soviet Union. Still, it was visible within the Soviet society in Latvia during the 60s, and I'll show its position on the crossroad between different tendencies, artistic and social. Moreover, I shall uncover the role the painting played as a part of visual universe of trials against war criminals conducted in Soviet Latvia. After the judgment of the German leaders responsible for the occupation of the Baltic countries in Riga in 1946, trials of criminals against humanity were held behind closed doors. And starting in 1959, a new phase came, and over a dozen of public trials took place in Latvia. And local authorities and the Communist Party made public documents and images of the atrocities committed by the Nazi, and among them, some dealt with the Holocaust. This painting, exhibited in parallel to the judicial proceedings, must be thus reinscribed in the context of their perception. My colleague, Eric Le Bourris, and myself work on public echoes of these trials, on the dynamics of discussions launched in the society by the judicial sphere. So approaching the social usages of the painting, I try to understand what role it played in channeling members of the Nazi crimes and in the structuring of groups which were mindful in the justice rendered. Relying on diversity of archives, institutional and private, political and artistic, textual, oral and visual in Latvia, in Russia and in the United States, I examined the creation of the painting, its perception and reemployment. Also, the book dedicated by David Zilberman to Kuzkovski is a crucial assemblage of testimony of the closest. So firstly, I'll speak about the complex artistic origins of this painting, which had an impact on the spectators, and then I shall study different levels of its visibility within the society in the 60s, and I'll be happy if somebody in this audience share with me your recollections on its perception here in Riga. A lot can be said on the genesis and the visual analysis of the painting. For lack of time, I'll retain only some postures that this canvas offers to viewers. It has been studied in 1944, when Kuzkovski was evacuated in Uzbekistan. His relatives in Ukraine were directly under the threat of the Nazi policy of extermination. Thus, Kuzkovski was on the lookout for reports and oral testimony about mass assassination of Jews, but also acceded to a fictional representation of murder, in particular to the film by Mark Donskoy, The Vanquished, Непокоренные, created in 1943-1945. Here in this film, Mark Donskoy reconstructed the massacre in Babi Yar, but Soviet spectators were started to be informed about what happened in 1941 already, and later in 1943. Under the influence of this film, Kuzkovski was turned about two themes to represent: path leading to death, or execution itself. And we see it in confronting the preparatory sketches from 44 till 48. The theme of the path progressively emerged and became in the core of the painting. And it's quite revealing of the debates at the end of the Second World War within the artistic Soviet milieu, what should be depicted: acceptance in the face of imminent death, or on the contrary, rebellion. The second element which I would like to underline is the place the painter confers to the viewer, to us. On the sketches, we see the point of view of one of the executioners or the victims. I can speak about it in detail during the discussion, but the final painting makes a silent shift. The spectator's point of view is placed down in the pit. Let's keep these aspects in mind. They will be useful for the analysis of the usages of the painting during the 60s. So, Film by Donskoy reports other contemporary paintings extolling victory constitute a fragmentary information at Kuzkovski's disposal, and it determines that the painting was not conceived as a testimonial, detailed work. It was also influenced by classic heroic style codes, which were familiar to Kuzkovski since the 30s and during the Second World War, when he was making propaganda, mobilization for war effort for TASS windows, and conducted agitational work within Uzbek population. And in Riga, after the war, while continuing to work on The Last Way, Kuzkovski executed a series on Lenin, a mosaic, Stalin is Our Son, portraits of leaders, other works devoted to the heroism during the revolution, the Civil War, and the Second World War. His career was rising in the 50s and 60s. One of the leaders of the artistic milieu in Latvia and member of the editorial team of State Publishing House, he was close to some public figures like Artur Eglitz, deputy director of the National Museum of Fine Arts in Riga. Also, Kuzkovski participated in the meetings between painters and the army for the exhibitions on the Second World War. The exhibitions started in the end of the 50s. And he was shortlisted for the state distinction. His institutional recognition seemed to have reached its apex in '69 when he chose to immigrate to Israel. In fact, during the 60s, he resumed his work on the Holocaust. He was both a recognized painter and a member of a nascent network pleading for the recognition of the Jewish victims. And more than a clear distinction, I see here a relationship between these two trajectories. In artistic field, the motives migrate from his works on the Holocaust to others dedicated to very legitimate themes in the USSR. And you can observe here, for example, this male figure holding a child that is represented in different cadres. Besides, during official meetings, Kuzkovski was part of those representing the Jews from Riga. Foreign visitors and Western communists were directed to him, identified as the artist of the Jewish community. On the contrary, a division between a recognized painter and a dissident was socially constructed during this decade, and it appeared in the context of fragmented spaces where visual narratives on the extermination of Jewish population were formed. On the one hand, the theme was present in the framework of trials and in media, in the courtrooms, on TV, documentary, cinema, and in the written press. And on the other hand, Kuzkovski exhibited actively, but on other themes. His paintings and etchings on the Holocaust were indeed not significantly brought into play by political actors. His Holocaust works were shown in other spaces, and now I'll approach different levels of their visibility. First, private visits to the artist's house, notably by active members from the Riga Jewish circles who turned the Rumbula forest into the place where homage was paid to the departed. And you know this engagement very well, starting by the rich work of Shmuel Zeitlin, and I don't detail it here. But in the beginning of the 60s, Kuzkovski offered to these activists, David Garber, Mark Bloom, Frida Mikkelson, and David Zilberman, his interpretation of the painting. According to Zilberman, the painter distinguished several key figures in the painting. Among them, Jewish Komsomols and Jewish Red Army soldiers. His reading of the artwork was embedded in the Soviet narrative of the war, which was formed during the war. But being rather critical towards the Soviet powers, the group formed around Rumbula perceived it differently. For them, a link between Nazi barbarism and the contemporary profanation of the Jewish mass graves was clear. And it's interesting to reflect on the difference of their socialization, probably generational gap also. Still, Kuzkovski joined their actions and fabricated this very famous billboard for the activist group. Set in Rumbula in a visible place, a few meters from the mass graveyards, this billboard was brought down by Riga municipal services on several occasions, and they toughened the relationship between Kuzkovski milieu and the authorities. Besides, Kuzkovski created an obelisk on the basis of the Last Way. It was inaugurated to commemorate the rise of the Warsaw Ghetto. According to the testimonies, that was a moment of consecration. Candles were lit in front, prayers were said, and afterwards the painting was abundantly photographed, and visitors also took pictures of themselves standing next to it. Thus, the artwork entered in the private sphere, but also its significance transformed. And the obelisk, the canvas, and the material changed. But more importantly, the painting was reframed. And I'd like to detail a little bit this manner in which the artist cut out his initial work for the community. It's crucial because the truths, the visuals tell us, are the product of an interaction with the viewer, and they result always from an interpretative exercise. So such a reframing signifies the removal of the diversity of the victims and of a wide array of attitudes towards imminent death. The stoicism of the old man of faith is brought forward. The rage of a young woman, member of the communist youth, according to Kuzkovski, her rage in front of the unfathomable extermination is turned by her into a form of dignity in the face of death. And finally, if the whole painting can evoke the gaze of the perpetrators, in the fragment, the executioners are completely removed from the site. And such reemployments became frequent when with a system of reproduction was put in place. For example, Aaron Spielberg made copies which were sent all over the Soviet Union. They were accompanied by books on Jewish culture, and thus The Last Way started to be distributed in a network of Soviet Jews sensitive to Israeli cause. The reproduction of Kuzkovski's painting continued after his departure to Israel for mass usage, like this one, and for restricted usage, for instance, in a handmade book written in 70, conserved in this museum. Its author reframed The Last Way, intertwined with prayers for the dead, self-portrait of the painter, photographs of the Warsaw Ghetto, abstracts from the Torah, and doing that, he conferred to the painting a quality of atemporality and non-territoriality. This is worth noting, as many observers, later observers of the painting, consider it portrays other sides of the Holocaust than Babi Yar. So here it's interesting how the painting becomes a space of experience, a space of very rich enactments. And the transformation of it into a real icon started already in Rumbula, became more acute here. So these reframings progressively reinforced two aspects: the gaze from the ravine and the disappearance of the criminals from the representation. Moreover, this interpretation is not neutral in the context of increasing mutual defiance between the authorities and the Rumbula group. Because initially, I consider Rumbula activists paid attention to how criminals were judged in the Republic and abroad, and progressively they distanced themselves from the justice rendered by the Soviet states for crimes against humanity. Several aspects can explain it. None of the trials was specifically on the murder of Rumbula, but also the toughening of the position during the Six-Day War. And at this moment, Kuzkovski himself turned his work into explicit support to Israel and, for sure, a crackdown of the advocates for the Alia. So the reinterpretations of the painting attest this rising distance. The second level of the usage of the painting and of the potential awareness of the Holocaust was its display within official exhibitions. Tracing back these appropriations helps examine the way the groups of viewers of works on the Holocaust were structured at this moment. And so the showing of The Last Way, which was entitled during the end of the 50s and the beginning of the 60s, to the memory of victims of fascism, and of the etchings, The Ghetto Uprising and We Will Live, sometimes gave rise to tensions, and at other moments, local authorities showed support. And these exhibitions went alongside the media treatment of the trials. For example, a personal exhibition in '67 at the VEV Culture Palace, where the most publicized trial of the Republic was held in '65. And on this occasion, the public saw works on the Holocaust, portraits of public figures from Riga's Jewish community, and on the opening night, Jewish artists made speeches, including in Yiddish. So during official exhibits and the recurring public receptions in the painter's workshop, viewers were inclined to be interested in different themes. Some abstracts from the visitor's book of the '64 exhibition in the State Museum of Latvian and Russian Art testify to this interrelatedness. I would like to quote two of them. I really liked the painting of Lenin and Stuchka, Lenin in 1900 and others. The painting celebrating victory also leaves a good impression. I was overwhelmed by the big and truthful painting to the memory of victims of fascism. Or another one, Comrade Kuzkovski, to the memory of victims of fascism and the Ghetto Uprising, put an extraordinary mark upon us. It strengthened our hatred of fascism. We would like our Soviet artists to further stigmatize Hitler's followers. As a former officer in the Soviet army during the Great Patriotic War, I met many victims of fascism. So exhibiting side by side paintings on the Holocaust next to paintings on the Soviet Revolution, for instance, had also an impact, was a framework for a certain perception of the crimes. And the distance separating the spectators from the dynamics spurred by the state also varies in these different situations. These personal exhibitions gave to different circles of Jews in Riga an opportunity to be in contact with each other. And thus, according to a commentary from a visitor, the '64 exhibition, I quote, turned to the Jews expressing solidarity with their painter under the banner of the national theme that was so close to their hearts, end of quote. Indeed, Kuzkovski's work occupy a position of mediator between public narratives on crimes and the commemorative effort. And doing that, the painter had the potential to heighten the need for justice within broader fractions of the society. And I observe it particularly on the third level of its exposure, the local one. A good example are his exhibitions held in Jekabpils and Daugavpils in the same sequence as the trials of local collaborators. For Jekabpils, for instance, 2 trials were conducted in June and November 65, and Kuzkovski made 2 exhibitions there in spring 65 and in November 66. These artistic events were set up by local party and were not illicit gatherings. Paintings about the Holocaust were exhibited in the town center. The press spoke about it. A group of Kuzkovski friends came from Riga for the occasion, and there were almost 500 local visitors. David Zilberman recalls the exhibition opening featured poetry, reading, and musical pieces interpreted by Jewish artists. The evening was hosted in Yiddish, Hebrew, Russian, and Latvian. And on the following day, the guests from Riga were taken to the old Jewish cemetery where the destroyed synagogue used to stand and where the Jewish population was slaughtered. And on this first private picture, we see a lawyer who came from Riga and a local survivor. On the second, a meeting of Kuzkovski with a witness. These private meetings coincide with the public status of the exhibition. All of this participated in establishing a common framework of interpretation of the slaughters and crimes. Interviews which Eric and myself conducted in Jekabpils confirm that copies of The Last Way circulated on the local level and sometimes were displayed at home. And locally, the knowledge of the perpetrators and their victims was part of daily life, of hot public debates, and there were strong expectations for justice from the survivors. Paradoxically, in the case of Jekabpils, the Soviet authorities did not show to the population that the culprits were punished. The trials were held in Riga, far from sight for the locals. A series of not illustrated articles were published, and a documentary dedicated to the first trial was broadcast without addressing the Holocaust among the facts really approached during the trial. On the contrary, the film glorified all the victims as pro-Soviet resistance. Although the recognition of groups of victims is crucial in judicial proceedings and in media. And on the local level, pro-Soviet resistance were visible, and you can see it on the slide, some film snapshots and photos of collective demonstrations. And via Kuzkovski exhibition, among other events, local Jewish survivors were given the opportunity to be visible in the public space and to plead for their memory. In the absence of a state body to fill the need for the social justice, Kuzkovski and the painting appeared as a possibility to initiate a collective remembering, a verbalization of the information. So, in conclusion, the circulation of The Last Way and of other Kuzkovski's work on the Holocaust deepens the comprehension of a stratified collective stance on the Holocaust during 50s and 60s. Examining diverse audiences enables to question the breadth of the debates around war crimes, and the painting was appropriated within multiple and fragmented public spaces, starting by the circles of activists and finishing by one group of citizens who felt concerned by the blood crimes during the war. The second vector of analysis is the action on the picture and the creation of the framework of its exhibit. Within different networks, the interpreters of the painting selected details, literally reframed it, and re-edited it with the help of texts, oral commentaries, and other images. And a wide range of interpretations corresponds to a large range of publics. So the understanding and the usage of the painting by the memorial community in Riga translate their gradual distancing from the judicial and political proceedings of the perpetrators. And personally committed to seeing justice, they did not give any credit to the authorities in charge of the judicial proceedings. And in the case of Jekapils, the painting permitted a relation between groups of survivors and spokespersons for the victims through a network in which Kuzkovski evolved. Within the context of the trial, it resonated in a wider state of tension related to the public recognitions of groups of victims on a local level. So the painting and the painter played the role of connecting link between collective representation of the crime and a strong memorial effort between judiciary proceedings, which only seemed to be for the show, and an autonomous social framework. Thank you very much for your attention.
So we have time for questions and comments, please. You're welcome. Well.
Thank you very much. This was very informative and interesting. As an American, I feel I know a limited amount about Kuzkovski. So I'm wondering, did he have personal experiences or ties to the Shoah in Latvia or elsewhere?
The personal experience of Kuzkovski? Yes, actually, his closest perished in Ukraine, and he was really closely linked to, that's why I spoke in the beginning about his attempts to research for the information about them and regroup in different sources of information when he was in Uzbekistan and when Jewish refugees came progressively to Uzbekistan. So he lost his closest in Ukraine occupied by the Nazis, and in the beginning of the 60s, in particular between 61 and 63, when the site of Babi Yar started to be more and more publicly covered, in particular with the involvement of Shostakovich and the poet Yevtushenko, Kuzkovski was in link with this site and with Shostakovich, with them in particular.
Okay, thank you. More questions? No, I have one. Ambiguously, inevitably, we see the role of the last way, the painting of the judicial, political, social, about the artistic value. It's a very typical piece of social realism. And how, so this such a piece of social realism is viewed from the art criticism point. We had a professor of art criticism almost. Svidlinska is teaching here art criticism. So how would you sort of evaluate the form, sort of the artistic value of the painting?
Thank you for this question. Actually, I'm not an art critic. I'm mostly a historian who work on visuals, so documentary visuals or artistic pieces. But it seems to me that this classic heroic style must be explained by the artistic, the professional socialization of Kuzkovski in Ukraine, actually starting by the 20s. He was completely in link with the Association of Revolutionary Artists in Ukraine, and even later, as I mentioned, in Uzbekistan, he was also influenced by this style of heroic realism. And what we can see, it's actually many links. Thanks to the large format of the painting and thanks to the lateral exposition of the figures, we can see many links with other classical painting, in particular of the 19th century, and there are many elements coming from Renaissance, coming from the painting of Salon of the 19th century. So for me, it's an interesting, eclectic piece from the artistic point of view.
Thank you. Probably somebody wants to put a question, another question, or make a comment. If not, let me just say that we had a wonderful section. We were very privileged to have here all the speakers of such a sort of exciting subject as discussed from very different perspectives. And I think we learned a lot. And so let's thank once again all the speakers of this session. Now the session is closed and I give the floor to Ilya for concluding remarks probably.